So I think we can go ahead. Let's start.
Right about now, the Funk Soul Brother. Check it out now, the Funk Soul Brother. Right about now, the Funk Soul Brother. Check it out now, the Funk Soul Brother. Right about now, the Funk Soul Brother. Check it out now.
Okay, Happy New Year, Happy New Year. So it's 2018 now, and Radio Entrepreneurship is back as well, obviously, and I'm not by myself as usual because Sabrine is here. Sabrine, Happy New Year, and how are you?
Hey, I'm fine as usual too, and yes, Radio Entrepreneurship is still here. Yoo-hoo! And we wish you all a very happy New Year 2018, full of success and happiness.
Okay, so thank you very much for this. We have a very first special guest this year. We are very, very pleased because we received someone who has an incredible life. So Dominique Trempont has been in Silicon Valley, I think, during all his life, and during his impressive career, he has been working for quite a long time with Steve Jobs. And obviously, this happened to quite a few people, and it's an impressive, very important experience in his life. So I have lots of things to learn today. So thank you very much, Dominique. How are you, Dominique? What time is it, by the way? You're in Silicon Valley right now?
Yes, I am. It's 8 in the morning.
Okay, so it's 5 p.m. here in Paris. So I'm going to introduce you a little bit because you're going to do this way better than I'm going to do. So you did INSEAD MBA. You got your INSEAD MBA during 1978, I think. And then you started to work, and you work in a company, an American company called Raysham. I think that's this company, which was a very big company. And then you moved to NeXT, and you work with Steve Jobs at that time. And then you had only successes. That's the feeling I have when I see everything you've done. It's all about big names, big corporations. You raised an incredible number of CEOs. That's my understanding. So many people who work with you became CEOs in their life. So how did all this actually start? Because you're not American, I think.
No.
So, okay, so why did you decide to go in Silicon Valley at that time during the 70s? It was absolutely not the same Silicon Valley that it is right now. There was a special reason for this?
Yes, I was actually not meant to be here. I studied in Louvain business and computer science and programming, and I fell in love with programming. I developed some very complex programs, and I was helped by IBM. Actually, they gave me access to their training center in La Hulpe, and put me in the computer room with 300 mainframes, and I was completely enamored with programming and what the computers could do. And I was meant to live my life in Europe. I was born in Paris, from Belgian parents, so I was meant to spend my life in Europe. In 1979, just before I graduated, I read a Fortune article on Apple. It was 4 years old, and it just spoke to me. I saw a culture that was completely not known to me. I saw Steve Jobs, who was very young. He was in his 20s at the time, and something happened to me. I basically felt a calling in some ways, and I decided to go explore Silicon Valley. I turned down all the usual suspects in Europe, the McKinsey and BCG and Shell Oil and all the big companies, and I went to work for a California-based company. And so that's how it started. I started working for Raychem in Paris, and then I was transferred intercompany to the United States, supposedly for a year, before I would come back and have a job in Europe, and never left, and they never sent me back, and they involved me everywhere around the world, and in 5 different businesses, and I stayed with Raychem 14 years. And so that's that part of my story, if you will. It all happened because I read an article in Fortune magazine.
So that's absolutely interesting. And as you said, you were very successful, you know, in a billion-dollar Silicon Valley-based company, Raychem. So what drove you to take a risk on an entrepreneurship track? After about 10 years, I was headhunted by a venture capitalist who invited me to have lunch. And he introduced me to the company that he was doing, and it was very interesting. And I asked all the questions, and then we got to the dessert, and he says, well, would you be interested that I make you an offer to run the company? And I gave him all the answers that a young European would give. It's, well, you know, we have a baby, and I need health insurance, and you don't offer health insurance, and it's a big risk. And I was kind of going into that line of discussion. And the guy got a bit annoyed with me, and he looked at me and he says, do you realize that you are probably 5 years from becoming a mommy? And and I looked at him, I said, what do you mean? And he says, if you don't take risk, that is the biggest risk in your life, because after 15 years in the same company, you will basically not be movable to anything else, and you will be made redundant one day and will not progress. So the biggest risk for you is not to take a chance. And the question is, what chance should you take? That was a huge change for me in my thinking. Before that, I thought, you know, if I work really hard and if I prove myself for a distant goal, I'll be happy and I'll do very well. And this is such a delusion. So that's when I decided that I should look at this as a risk reward in my life. And I was young enough that I could take some chances and had experience enough that I would probably be successful. And this is the trigger that got me into entrepreneurship and major turnarounds, etc. Because turnarounds are, in a way, a form of entrepreneurship where you have to reinvent a company as you go.
I think that this advice is still very valid today, obviously. So you decided to become an entrepreneur and do turnaround, and you did this with Steve Jobs. So actually, how did you meet, and what happened, and why? Is it you who came to him? Is it him who came to you? How all this happened, basically?
I was repainting my living room in my house on a Sunday morning, and my wife took a phone and took a call, and he was saying, "This is Steve Jobs, is Dominique there?" And she answered, "Yes, and I'm the Queen of England." And he said, "No, this is Steve Jobs. I would like to talk to Dominique." So he said, "You know, I have heard about you from two of my board members, and they think that you and I should work together, that you have proven yourself, and that you have the personality to work with me. And are you free this afternoon?" and for an hour or so. So I took this address, I drove to his house in the afternoon, and we exchanged views for about an hour, and we ended up spending 6 hours together. We walked all around Palo Alto together, and he cooked for me, he opened a bottle of wine, and we had dinner with him and Laureen, his wife, and he was kind of ready to make me an offer in some ways at the end of that interview. And I told him, well, you know, I've heard not so good things about where NeXT is. NeXT is basically a failing company, and you're not easy to work with. And so I need about 2 months to talk to the engineers, to talk to the customers, to do my due diligence. And after that, I will come back to you and we'll talk about working together or not. He didn't like that answer, obviously. But I maintained that position, and I did my due diligence, and I came back to him with a list of about 10 things that I wanted before I joined the company, in the way we would work together, and who makes decisions on what and what my role was going to be, etc. And he agreed. And that was the best thing that I have done, because that enabled me to work successfully with Steve. And he always respected that agreement, if you will, between the two of us.
And that's an interesting point you mentioned. You joined NeXT after it had failed as a hardware company.
Yes.
Nobody ever turned around a hardware company into a software company. Can you please let us know, how did you succeed?
It's John Doerr, who is a famous venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. He was at Kleiner Perkins at the time, and he told me, you know, be careful, because nobody ever turned around a hardware company into a software company, as you say. And culturally, it's a very different thing. You know, the hardware people tend to want to give the software away for free. The software people want to run on other people's hardware. And so it's constant battle. And you don't change a company that was a hardware company to become a software company. So we actually went down from about 600 people when I joined, back to about 180. And the bulk of that was the engineering team, the software engineering team. And then we started hiring people selectively to work with us in sales and in other functions of the company. We went back to zero in revenue. We literally restarted completely. We put our software to run on other people's computers. So on HP, on the Sun Microsystem, etc. And it was called Next Step, which is what you see in the Mac today. It is the client that you see on the Mac today. And it was running our own operating system, the Mac, MACH, which was a Unix version. And then we ran it across different operating systems also. So we were also running on top of HP UX, Solaris, Microsoft Windows NT, etc. And it was an okay strategy. It got us major accounts. They were developing mission critical applications. We had the best trading houses that were using our software for mission critical applications. We had the mobile players who were activating sound-based systems to detect what's wrong on a cell phone, etc., with our stuff. So people like Macau Cellular, that became AT&T Wireless, developed their applications on our platform. But it was not going to be a big thing. It was, that's where we got lucky. The internet was born on the the World Wide Web was born on the NeXT platform. Tim Berners-Lee and people at CERN were all using NeXT to develop the World Wide Web, because I don't want to be too technical, but because we were the only platform that had dynamic objects. So you could distribute data on the network, you could distribute an application on the network, you could have a middleware elsewhere on the network, and it was all working together. And we saw that. We understand some of the potential of it. I don't think we completely fully understood the full potential of the internet at the time, the World Wide Web. Mark Andreessen actually came to see Steve Jobs to talk about Mosaic. That's before I joined. And Steve basically turned him down, saying, "Thank you, but no thanks. Anybody can write 1,300 lines of code." And so he went on and created Netscape. And we had our own browser, and we basically decided to bet the farm on the emerging World Wide Web.
Looks like an amazing time, because all the names that you're talking about, all the people you're talking about, yeah, it's so yeah. So basically, you spent several years with Steve Jobs, working, I think, on a daily basis with him. And so there is a famous sentence by someone called His Exxon, I think, who said that he was both an asshole and a genius. And so I guess you have your own point of view about this. So personally, what do you think? And how was it to work with someone like him on a daily basis, practically?
Well, the short answer to your question is that he was not easy to work with, but he was not an asshole in the real sense, and he was not a genius either. People love to talk about genius, talking about Steve Jobs, and I'll explain that. The reason I say he was not an asshole is that why would hundreds of very talented people actually do very well in their career and develop themselves and want to work with Steve over the years? So I'm not very happy about that side of the biography by Isaacson, because I think he missed a complete side to the story. I've seen basically the way it works with Steve is that you were first of all, you had your honeymoon. So for, I would say, you know, in my case, it probably lasted 8 weeks, where I could do no wrong. I was the best, you know, everything I was doing is fantastic. He was constantly pushing me in engineering to talk to them and in front of customers, etc. And then one day, I have no idea what happened, and I didn't really know this process. Everything turned around and became negative. And he basically was pushing back on everything, and everything that I proposed, you know, it was never good enough. And it was really disconcerting. And this lasted for about 4 weeks, and I didn't know what was going on. I started to think, oh my God, you know, maybe I made the biggest mistake of my life here. I shouldn't be here. I stayed the course, and I did push the envelope on a few things. I basically made some things happen for the company that were amazing. And then one day, Steve turned around, gave me a big hug, and I was accepted in the inner circle. I had passed the acid test, as I call it. And so going through this process, I understood kind of that was this process to switch you from kind of doing business as usual to doing the best you can, and to expect very high deliverables and very difficult things to change and to perform at a very high degree. So I got the message that this was what was going to be needed to turn around the company. I'll talk more about the methodology we use to do this, to turn around the company, because I think it's an insightful methodology. As far as being a genius, I don't think Steve was Einstein or equivalent, or Da Vinci, or, you know, he was somebody who had interests in life, and he had kind of dreams of products for himself. I'll take the cellular phone as an example. Ever since I met him, I saw him play with cellular phones. He was looking at the palm very carefully, and you would go in his office, he would be in silence, he would look at this thing, he would play with this thing. And he told me that he was looking at a cell phone, and ever since he did the Mac, that actually there was a small project in the Mac team on a cell phone based on the Mac way back when. And I could see that every single time he would not be satisfied with what he saw. And he was constantly talking to people about smartphones, etc. And he would gather about a dozen people typically around himself who were expert in one field, or to put the maximum code, for instance, on a chip, which is what is needed to do for a smartphone, obviously, and security and user experience on a smartphone. And nobody was using this word smartphone at the time. The point I'm making here is that he accepted decades of discovery in order to come up with the right smartphone recipe, essentially. And he surrounded himself with people, and he would basically connect the dots between what people thought, what he thought. And it was a very specific process, and he would not push the execution button as long as he didn't have what he thought he needed to succeed. And this patient creative process was very impressive to me. He didn't rush to do things. He basically said that the chips are not ready, or the OS is not ready, or we don't know how to do applications, etc. And so it's that was basically the reason I'm saying I don't think he was a genius, but he could necessarily himself. He was a very smart guy, but he could create a process that would basically generate genius ideas over time, and he matured them.
This has lots of consequences on the product development, because when I look at many startups that I know even now who actually don't have the patience to release something which is very nice, very good, and really the top, and obviously most of them fail because you provide the market with something which is not good enough. What you say that he could wait, because anyway what he wanted was to release something really flawless, really fine, and it was not possible unless all the conditions and all techniques are available to make it.
Yes, I think he was actually quite skeptical about even the iPhone initially, and I've heard indirectly that our former Chief Technical Officer, Jean-Marie Hulot at NeXT, played a role into conceiving the iPhone model, essentially, with an app store, etc. And he had long discussions with Steve about that. And I think when Steve saw that the business model of a smartphone was going to be working, and it satisfied his own requirement that he could make it work. They went very, very quickly at Apple, and they, I think the division was started immediately, and it took a bit more than a year to come up with the first prototypes. They very, very fast, because it was a complete transformation. The idea of putting a complete operating system on a device that you would carry with you all the time was completely revolutionary. Nobody had ever thought of something like that.
Mm. And Dominique, going back to working with Steve Jobs, you said that you exchanged some views together. You said that he has his way of testing people. Could you let us know, could you share what you have in common with him, and what enabled you to work with him while many others failed?
Yes. We came from different planets, obviously. He was adopted, and you can read all of that in the biography. Adopted children tend to want to prove that they matter to the world. And for Steve, that was a major, I don't think he was aware of that, but this notion that a world I matter was a very big driver for him. And I came from a very successful family, comfortable, my grandfather was a very well-known guy. My father was very successful. I was expected to be successful, not to take too much risk, just to carry the flame of the family. I was far away from being an entrepreneur at heart, because I didn't need to be. I had good diplomas, I graduated summa cum laude. Everybody was telling me that I was really smart and that, I was going to do very well, etc. And what changed for me when I came to the US is that I gradually got what I call a growth mindset. And a growth mindset is very different from a comfort zone mindset. So I constantly was going across my comfort zone into kind of danger. And I still do have what I call the butterfly test. If something looks a bit scary to me, or I feel I don't know enough of it, etc., I decide that's a good thing. And I like to be at the edge of my comfort zone and get into things that change and challenge me. And so I developed this, and maybe I had that in me to start with. I'm very curious. I love to experiment. I love design. I love very well-made things. And when I met Steve for the first time, I think all of this came about. I even said something to him that was politically completely incorrect. I remember he was walking me to the door after dinner, and I looked at his house and I said, "Boy, Steve, you really have a sense of aesthetic of a woman." And he looked at me, in the way he looked at people, very stern. And he says, well, I guess I should take that as a compliment. And I said, I really mean it. I think that you have a quality of a sense of aesthetics that is very uncommon. And so to develop a bit that mindset, growth mindset, it's very strange, but in Silicon Valley, when you interview somebody, either when I was being interviewed to become CEO of a company, or when I interview people to come and work for me, you talk, after you understand their skills, etc., the experiences, you talk about failure. And it's very, I wouldn't say fashionable, but it's the things you talk about. You talk about how did you fail? And if the person on the other side says, well, I never really failed, in Silicon Valley, it's a red flag. It's, oh my God, you know, this guy thinks he's walking on water and is yet to fail. And they want to see, we want to see resiliency to, you know, how did you fail? Did you fail with grace, for instance? Did you let your customers down? Did you let your employees down? You had some amazing engineers. Did you basically say, hey, I failed, I put the key under the doormat and good luck? Or did you actually soft land them somewhere and did it with grace? And so we all know that what we do in what we do, there is a high risk of failure, and that maybe 8 times out of 10, you're going to face failure. And in fact, a progression of a company always feels like, you know, oh my God, if we don't solve this, we may fail. But it's how you handle it and how you handle the stress and how it activates certain genes in you that say, okay, you can do better. You can think about this in a different way. You can solve this. You can, if you need to take a flight, go see the customer, tell him to be patient and that they'll get something better, etc., etc. So it's how do you become a tiger in a mode where you constantly are pushing the envelope is a big thing. And that was one thing that was very important between Steve and I. We had that in common in some ways. The second one is I have a pretty deep liberal arts background. I love philosophy. I love all the culture. I love music. I love everything. And he does too. And we are both very attracted by technology and are comfortable working with very technology people and very talented people. And we both learn the vocabulary. We both develop the vocabulary. And it's this constant marriage between our human function and our technology functions. That was, I think, another aspect that linked us, essentially. The last thing that I want to talk about on this point is that it was very clear when you worked with Steve Jobs that he wanted A players around him. And he used to say A players recruit A plus players, B players recruit C plus players, and B minus players recruit Z players. And he said, you know, if you don't have in your engineering team and in your executive team A players, you're going to dilute the standard of the company, and you're going to basically have people who are there for a cruise, to go along for a cruise as opposed to really changing the world. And I have that belief too. I did I learned that at RACAM, and we had very high standards for people. We had very high standards for performance, and we were rewarding people for great performance, but we were expecting it. And if you were not capable of delivering what was expected, we wouldn't keep you. So that general theme around talent management was a core philosophic aspect that between him and me also.
Okay. Steve Jobs had one special. It's amazing to see the number of business he started, very diverse, and we can talk about obviously Apple, NeXT, Pixar, and many stuff. Basically, he managed to run this, to create this, and to make a success of all this. And most people would say that it's not possible, that it's difficult at least to succeed once. So I'm not even talking about succeeding twice or three times. How is it possible? What are the qualities, and how is it basically possible to do something like this and to tackle what others would consider impossible?
Well, the definition of impossible is nothing is impossible when you think of it. It's a question of mindset. If you put your mind to figure out, would it be impossible to make ice out of water? Well, sure. If you're a caveman, you think, I cannot make a solid out of liquid. And then suddenly something happens, and it shows you that there is a icicle somewhere, and you can think about it and say, oh, I can make ice. So this, it's a question of mindset. It's a question of curiosity. It's a question of thinking about what it takes to, I take an example of Elon Musk, for instance. Why do you think you can transform yourself into a private NASA? And basically be able to send rockets on the moon. And I mean, that's crazy. And by the way, you're going to do that while you're doing Tesla and you're doing a solar operated car, and you're basically revolutionizing car making. And while you have, and before that you did PayPal, etc., etc. I mean, all these things, we are constantly in Silicon Valley faced with doing the impossible. And we are used to not think that way. We are used to say, would it be better if the world was X and evolve in this direction? And then we put teams together to go address that. I'll give you an example. So I've always been very interested in topics like water. We take water for granted, and water is so essential for feeding people, to creating food, animals, agriculture. Water is very important to drink. Water can be a vector of diseases. In India, there are the equivalent of 4 747 Boeings full of children who die every day. I was always thinking in the back of my mind, how do we address the reduction of water around the world? Even though we have climate change and we have global warming, we seem to have less and less quality water. And I met with a young company called Energy Recovery that was set on a mission to transform seawater to drinkable water. And even though it's not my core field, I felt completely in love with the company and with the motto of the company. I could totally see that changing the world. And so I joined their board, and we made the impossible happen. We literally made the transformation of seawater to drinkable water economically feasible. 70% of the cost of transformation of the seawater to drinkable water is energy, and we basically eliminated that element of the cost, and we brought down substantially the cost of creating fresh water to drink. And it was quite a journey. It took several years, but countries like Israel, for instance, function completely on water desalination today. They are one of the few countries where the industrial capacity of the country is backed by desalination. Their agriculture is desalination based. Their drinking water is desalination based. And they discovered something that is going to be even more important in the 21st century, is that water is also a currency for political presence in a region. And so they work very closely with the Palestinians and their neighbors, the Arab neighbors, on water issues. And Israel basically provided water to their neighbors. And that was kept very, very secret by the Israeli because they and the Arab neighbors, because they didn't want to expose this. And then suddenly they realized, wait a minute, this may be the way we can deal with our issues. Instead of looking at this as an exception, maybe this should become the principle, that we focus on common problems and we solve them together. And that's a bit the spirit of what I'm describing. Is how to turn an impossible situation into a possible situation. Is to align on very clear goals, to have clear expectations as how you need to perform to achieve this goal, and then to put the organization and talent in place to achieve it, and to be very disciplined about the execution. And it's kind of a process that feeds itself. If you and this is probably where I should tell you about the methodology we used at NeXT. We had what I called the top 10 process. Each of the executive team member had typically 10 things that they needed to achieve in order to get the company to succeed. And it was, very difficult things. It was come out with this new product that was using a new way of doing code that had never been done before. It was for the VP of sales to win 5 of the most demanding customers in the world. It was being able to do a partnership with Microsoft, for instance, in our case. It was, so every single one of us had a list of about 10 things that was very, very demanding, including Steve. Steve would have his own top 10. And on there was a name, which was who is responsible for this. There is the core team responsible for this. There is a date. There is interdependency. So we could talk about, our other executives were standing in delivering to that that deliverable. And we were monitoring every Monday morning that list. And if there was a problem in one of the lists, we would all kind of put our heads together and figure out what do we do to make it a success. Who do we put on this to help the team? What other executive team members should go help the team? What other resource? So for instance, in professional services, should we put some of our best professional services on the engineering team to come up with something that will work with customers, etc.? So we were constantly looking at this as a resource allocation mechanism. And I have to say that this has been so profoundly successful for us that I've adopted that as a method in every single company I ran after that. This also served to assess performance of people, to assess compensation. At the end of the year, you just looked at the top 10s that were changing. Obviously, they were getting updated, and you very clearly who was performing, who was not performing in the executive team. And we had that top 10 was broken down in our troops. So every single one of our direct reports had top 10s, and every single one of their direct reports had top 10s. When I was going to Japan, for instance, and reviewing the Japanese team, I would start with their top 10. And this became the mantra of the company. And one thing it does is that it completely removes discrete resource allocation in the company. So all the people who have their little projects that they like to work on the side, etc., disappears because there is no room for that. It's a complete alignment of resources and goals. And that allows you to do things that are deemed to be impossible.
So obviously the KPIs that you need to use in order to follow up everything is changed. It's based on completion and not on personal targets. It's really about the project and going the right direction.
Yes, totally.
This is good. I like it.
It's very simple. It's extremely simple.
But I thought I think it's a very interesting point of view, and that most of the time it explains the success of a lot of companies. You know, they have they put away, you know, the personal projects, and they work, you know, for the big one. So that's extremely stimulating, personally, I think. And talking about this, you know, you've been working closely with Steve Jobs. You've been inspired also, you know, by him. When you left NeXT, did you stay in touch with him?
I did, to some extent. We were not what I call friends, you know, at least in my definition. We liked each other. We saw each other casually from time to time. One day, about a year after he rejoined Apple, he called me and he says, "Can I invite you for lunch?" And I thought, well, that's very nice, absolutely. I have a new sushi chef at Apple, and come try it. You'll like it, I think. So I went to Apple, and my friends who were working with him at Apple told me, "Be careful, he's going to offer you a job." And I had been CEO of Gemplus Corporation, and we were focused on mobile applications on the cell phone and on the smartphone. And I was done with that, and I was looking at my next opportunity. And so I wanted to do a startup, and I was very attracted by artificial intelligence. So I went to the lunch, and I had decided I'm not going to let him speak. I'm going to basically fill the space with artificial intelligence and the opportunity I was seeing, and to automate technical support with artificial intelligence, and the power of the cloud, and all of of that. And so I did a fantastic job filling the time and basically talking to him about me as a CEO, and that I enjoyed so much doing that. And so when we were done with the meal, he basically looked at me and he says, I shouldn't even try. And I looked at him and said, well, I'm not sure what you're talking about. And so I finessed it. He understood I finessed it, and he was not very happy that I turned him down. So that in a way was a downer in our relationship, because you don't say no to Steve Jobs easily. Hindsight, I was probably crazy not to go work with him at Apple. I would be in a position to make mega contributions to INSEAD, etc. But I'm actually, I don't regret anything. I did my artificial intelligence company, and I learned tremendous amount. I did my startup. I did a few other startups in parallel, and I saw him a couple of times after that, and we had a very decent, very good relationship. We had a chat around our children and whatever happened if we died, and but it's not like we were friends and we were seeing each other all the time.
So you went in artificial intelligence, and you made many things. So what now? What are your interests right now? And you're involved in many startups. What is your daily life, and which field are you especially interested? Water and all the stuff?
Yes, something happened to me in 2001. I was exploring, should I become a venture capitalist? And I spent close to 2 years working with Kleiner Perkins and with Battery Ventures as a CEO in residence. I was looking at a bunch of opportunities. I was saying, would I want to become a venture capitalist, for instance, and do I like the partnership, etc. And you have to remember that that time was absolutely terrible. It was kind of the ice age of startups, and it was nothing was going on, nothing was getting funded, etc. And frankly, the ideas were not very good either. I reviewed 300 pitches, and none of them made any sense to me. And so then nature got involved. I had a bucket list. One of the things I wanted to do was to ride a great horse again. And so I went to, I used to do jumping at a pretty high level when I was young. I was trained with the British team and the Irish team, etc. So I decided to go buy a wonderful horse, and I looked at 100 of them everywhere in Europe and in the United States. And I bought like my dream horse, dressage horse, from a German Olympic rider who was silver medalist at the Olympics, and I brought him back. His name was Calypso.
It was Paul Schreckmühl or someone else?
No, it was.
Is that right? Okay.
Anyway, so to make a long story short, I took him out of his stall one day about a year and a half later, and I don't know what happened, but I was dragged by the horse for a mile at full gallop with my head between the front hooves. I was literally, I was unconscious. I was taken to Stanford. I was in a coma for 4 weeks. And if you know anything about coma, now today they don't let you in coma for 4 weeks. After 2 weeks, they pull the plug in the United States. So I was literally 2 days away from dying. And because they were going to pull the plug, they asked my sons to come and say goodbye. And then one of my sons offered to that I should have one of my key friends come over and speak to me to try to wake me up. And so we did that, and I woke up literally a few hours before they unplugged me. So I had the kind of very unique experience of getting near death and coming back. And that completely changed the way I looked at things. I said, you know, okay, I'm not supposed to be here anymore. And so what is it that I really want to do for the next couple of decades in front of me? I went into a sort of a retreat at the end of my rehabilitation. And I thought I was fine. I was convinced I was fine. And one of the things I decided is that I don't really want to be a CEO anymore. I don't really need to be a CEO anymore. I have nothing to prove to myself. On the other hand, I felt like I was losing my creativity, that I did so much, you know, travel 80% of my time, be very stressed, etc., that I basically, my creativity was coming down. And I thought, how do I get my creativity back? So that's when I thought about photography, and I've always been in love with photography ever since my youth, and I decided to go back seriously into it. To activate the parts of my brain that is more on the creativity side. And I did a few other, I had a few other resolutions like this, including that my family has had a long line of teaching people, professors. My grandfather was president of the oldest university in Belgium, and my father was a professor also while he was a businessman. And so I said, why don't I explore teaching? And that's when, in fact, INSEAD contacted me to start teaching. And I did a class in Singapore. And then I did building tech businesses in Silicon Valley for 6 years. So this kind of major crossroad in life basically got me to say, you know, and professionally, I don't really need to run a company anymore. My ego is satisfied, I think, and I want to become a CEO whisperer. I want to basically be on boards and help CEOs succeed. So I went down that path, and I've been on multi-billion-dollar company boards, on the board of 3Com, Felisa, etc. I've been on private company boards and basically scaled them to go public, and I've done a few smaller companies than that, more as a, you know, to help recruit the CEO, the key executive team, etc., etc. So I spend my life between very large companies. I'm on the board of a company in London, who is an amazing company, DMGT, that has media, that has B2C businesses, and that has B2B businesses. It is not yet a technology company, and we are working together to make it a lot more technology enabled. I just stepped down from the Board of Energy Recovery, where I am a shareholder, a relatively significant shareholder, at least from my point of view. It's going very well, and I'm now an investor, basically, and I can trade my stock anytime I want. I'm on the board of Real Networks, where I'm the lead director, and I work very closely with Rob Glazer, the founder and CEO, to turn around the company. And on the board of On24, which is a B2B marketing communication company, automation, doing webcasting, etc. And we are working on taking that company public also. And I'm doing a lot of artificial intelligence stuff because I want to get, I have a huge advantage is that I've done a company in artificial intelligence. So I know what works, what doesn't work, including the use cases, etc. So I'm very fascinated by that, and I'm probably going to spend the next 10 years of my life focus on artificial intelligence and how it transforms user experience, personalization, automation, medicine even. I've been exposed recently to some medical evolution in terms of how the gut is linked to the brain, and how, in fact, the health of the gut is predicting the health of the brain. And I think we can do an incredible business in gathering data on gut and basically help people not to get into Alzheimer, Parkinson's, etc. So to me, all of these things, it's a bit like water. It's one of the big issues of the world, and it attracts me tremendously. And I would love to help people with whatever I've learned and whatever I can contribute.
Okay. It's the end of this show. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure. And I always have the same question I ask, which is about music. And I just wanted to know if, as you seem to enjoy life quite a lot, you talked about music. Is there something special music that you relate to when it's about entrepreneurship, when it's about joy, when it's about energy and all this? There's something?
Well, I might disappoint you, but my music in entrepreneurship is silence. Fine. So for me, I've learned to meditate pretty carefully in a pretty disciplined way. And that's where I get to clarity. And for me, in stressful situation or in high opportunity situations, this being calm is so important. So that's where I go for inspiration, is into silence and calm. And I love jazz, I love rock and roll, I love classical music. When I travel around the world, I try to go to concerts, etc. But for me, there is a theme, which is that even with classical music or jazz, I go into kind of a meditation mode when I listen to it. And it's a very interesting place of the mind where ideas come up, where junk gets discarded, where what's essential gets to the top. And that's where I go for my inspiration.
I think that we could organize a full radio show about meditation and about this type of Very interesting stuff. I like this as well, so I understand what you mean.
Yeah, I was about to say that it could be very interesting that you exchange views also with Gilles, because it looks like you have a lot of common points too.
True. I recognize some stuff, but it's gonna be cut in the show.
Maybe next time I come to Fontainebleau.
Yeah, it would be
Great.
definitely a pleasure. Dominique, it was really a pleasure. Thank you very much. So I'm going to wrap up this show. And Sabrine, maybe you want to do it, by the way. Maybe you want to wrap this up.
No, but just would like to thank again, Dominique. It was a real pleasure to listen to your journey, and it was very inspiring too. Thank you very much for the time you allocated for us.
My pleasure.
Okay. I wish you a very good day, Dominique. And the next show should be from Singapore. Normally, it's not yet sure, but we're traveling all around the world, and it should be about health industry in Singapore, worldwide, but from Singapore.
Changing time zones.
Yeah, exactly.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much, and wish again a very happy 2018. 2018, yeah, that's true. Year, and it should be a great year for everyone. Bye-bye from Paris.
Bye-bye.
Bye from Fonzie.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye from Silicon Valley.
Okay, bye. Take care. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Piano piano scendo il fiume, lungo le sue rive la solitudine via immensa, così solo. Non voglio più essere questo isolotto separato, questa testa scura su un continente di luci. C'è questa città in me, popolata di perdenti, di truffe.
trên hòn đảo nhỏ cách biệt này, cái chòm tối trên lục địa đầy ánh sáng, có một thành phố trong tôi, sống đầy người thiếu may mắn, gian dối. Nhưng có một khu vực hoang vu và là nơi tôi phải đến đó. Thong thả, tôi phải theo dòng sông chảy. Thong thả tìm đến những người đàn bà, những người đàn ông, sống một cuộc sống của thế giới này, dệt một miếng vải lụa cho một thế giới sau. Thong thả, tôi tìm đến cái thế giới sau đó.